What's up, Facebook? Um, Over the past couple of days, I've been asked a very powerful question, um, and I've seen a lot of discussion about this topic. And the question is, what is the real definition of police brutality? And one of my friends who's a business leader, an outstanding business leader in the Latino community, asked me this question: what is the definition of police brutality? The first thing to understand about police brutality is that there are some common across the board definitions, but for the most part, police brutality will always be determined and decided on a case-by-case basis. Police brutality can be something as simple as putting handcuffs on a compliant person too tight or too tightly. Or you could put handcuffs on a 5 or 6-year-old very gently, and that can be considered police brutality. In both those circumstances, that would go against most police departments' directives and policies across the board. Police brutality is often evaluated and calculated by the department heads in the police department and ultimately by prosecutors if there is charges to be filed against a police officer for engaging in police brutality. If you sue the police department, a jury could very well decide indirectly if the police officer engaged in police brutality that ended up in a injury that has damages attached to it. But in the majority of the cases, police brutality can take place, and it will be ruled police brutality if an officer engages in unnecessary, rough, or violent, or verbal behavior that goes beyond the level of compliance of someone who's in custody. So if you have somebody in custody, or you've detained somebody as a police officer, and that individual is acting in the most compliant way and following directives, and the officer is continually yelling at them for no justification, no reason, just because the officer is trying to instigate or edge them on, or if the officer is just trying to get a reaction and the person is following all the directives and being totally compliant, just the verbal representations of the police officer, if they're unnecessary, if they're aggressive in manner, overly, the verbiage is insulting, it's filled with slurs and curse words, and it's just totally inappropriate, that is a form of police brutality. Any physical roughness with a person in custody or a person who's being detained, where the individual is totally being physically compliant, they are not offering any type of physical resistance, they are physically moving in the direction and complying physically with the officer's orders, any type of roughness, or even the officer unnecessarily putting their hands on the individual who's totally being compliant and not physically posing a threat, that can be that can constitute police brutality. In most situations where an officer can de-escalate a person and bring him into compliance before he engages in police brutality or some form of physical engagement, in most cases like that, if the individual is not following instructions or is not going along with the de-escalation process or the attempts by the officer. The officer is just trying to calm him down. He's giving him lawful orders, and the person in custody is not hearing it. They are being very verbally combative. They are positioning themselves as if they are ready to be physically combative and physically resistive of any type of control by the officer. In almost every one of those scenarios, an officer taking physical action, making physical contact with the subject, and maybe even going overboard, almost will never be considered police brutality. Almost in most situations, an officer can get away with overreacting and using physical force when somebody is resisting. Officer has a huge shield to place themselves behind, and they can just say, hey, for my own safety, I went and I engaged at this level. I had fears for other people's safety and my own safety, other people's lives and my own lives, so I engaged like this. Many times, even when somebody's being resistant and being verbally combative, the actions of an aggressive officer are unnecessary. However, in many situations when supervisors or state's attorneys or prosecutors are reviewing camera footage, they always view in favor of the officer, and they view it against the interests and the welfare of the subject who's in custody. Oftentimes, you have to be an extremely vulnerable person for higher-ups, supervisors in the police department, or prosecutors to evaluate a situation where someone is being aggressive towards a police officer, the police officer being aggressive in response, and then the decision being made that the officer engaged in police brutality. It has to be in a situation where the person is very vulnerable. So if the person is very young and won't listen to the officer, is being combative, even physically combative, and the officer responds to a child who's of a certain age and they're single digits, that could still be police brutality. An elderly person, a feeble elderly person who won't comply, maybe even being physically combative, but just poses zero threat, and the officer slams an elderly person down on the ground who's got a cane. Someone who may be autistic, somebody who may be suffering from some form of mental illness, and it's clear and it's evident that the officer can call back up and use different types of restraints instead of engaging in police brutality, even if the person is combative. In those limited situations, footage or taking testimony from witnesses, the analysis will be in favor of the person who's being detained or who's in contact or in custody of the police. Having said that, there's a whole different set of rules for black men. Not even black women, black men. Black men based on their size alone, or their facial expressions, or the way they're dressed, or just the way they're speaking, even if they're not engaging in cursing or disrespect. Their tone and their level of intimidation through their voice, size, hairstyle, dress can excite an officer and have him engage in police brutality. I remember I watched footage of an NFL player being pulled over several years ago, and he was massive. He had to be over 300 pounds, and he was tall. And you could tell that the officer who pulled him over by himself in the middle of the night was extremely afraid of him. But the giant NFL player was a gentle giant. He followed every directive and every order of the police officer. He was extremely compliant, very respectful. But the officer was giving him orders and threatening him. You know, if you move suddenly, I'm going to do this to you. If you don't obey my command, I'm going to shoot you. And the NFL player did not give him a reason to talk like that. But the officer was scared based on his size. If it was me, he would have never spoken to me like that. I look like a nerd. I look like I play chess on the weekends. I never have an officer yell at me because he's intimidated by me. Sometimes I don't like that. Sometimes I want to be intimidating. I want to be imposing. But they just look at me as if I'm a nerd and they just say, get out of here. You're not a problem. But anyway, so when it comes to black men, they can't raise their voices like a white soccer mom can. They cannot be verbally combative. They cannot question. We all saw the video with the lieutenant in Virginia, full uniform, serving this country. He did not comply with the wishes and the demands and the commands of the officer. But at no time did he raise his voice. He was very soft-spoken. He was very calm. But simply because he did not listen to the officers, they got excited. They pepper sprayed him. They got him out of the car. They were very threatening. Their guns were drawn. He took a long time to pull over. Simply not pulling over for a mile and a half will excite the officer and get him in a mode where he's ready to engage in police brutality. And oftentimes, he'll be cleared. He or she will be cleared. If it's an old white lady or a middle-aged soccer mom and the same language is used, guns are drawn, if it's in an upscale neighborhood, that same officer can be reprimanded and the video will be viewed more in favor of the person who's in custody or who's in contact with the officer. There's a different set of rules for black men. Our hands need to be extremely visible, not showing your hands, not letting the officer know where your hands are alone, coupled with your size, coupled with the type of clothing that you're wearing, coupled with the type of hairstyle you have. Those things can get an officer to be aggressive, to take physical force when it's not needed, and oftentimes internally it will be deemed justifiable. It is extremely important, if you are a physically fit black man who can potentially pose a threat, that you verbally indicate to the officer that you intend to comply, that you will comply, that you are complying. Oftentimes you have officers who have egos, who, if you don't comply with them or you challenge their authority, they will engage in unnecessary conduct that can be considered police brutality. Going back to the example of the lieutenant who was pulled over in full uniform in Virginia, when the officer said, "Get out of the car," they ordered him and they were yelling at him very aggressively. They had their guns drawn. And the lieutenant kept saying, "What's going on?" His hands were shown. His hands were out the side of the car, and he kept saying, "What's going on?" They must have said, "Get out of the car," at least 15 times, and he kept saying, "What's going on?" All that does is make the officers more angry, and failure to comply with a lawful order of a police officer will often justify them engaging in police brutality. When you're in police custody, an officer has 99% control. I remember when the officer pulled over Sandra Bland and the discussion was going back and forth. When he told her, put out the cigarette, she said, why? Why do I need to put out the cigarette? He did not like her challenging her his authority. She should not have had to put out the cigarette, but there was an argument made that he didn't feel comfortable with her smoking. She could have used the cigarette as a weapon. And there's a lot of discretion. When an officer is engaging with a civilian, he can, within reason, determine what's threatening to him and what actions he needs to take to remove that threat. If an officer honestly talks about how, I didn't like her tone, I didn't like her attitude, I didn't like the fact that she was smoking, I felt that she could have used that cigarette as a weapon, he'll be given the benefit of the doubt. Now, this officer, if he has two testicles and he's a real man, he's not going to feel threatened by a female smoking a cigarette. He just didn't like her dismissive attitude, so he tried to justify that her smoking was not something he wanted. And when she did not put the cigarette out, he escalated the level of violence that he used against her. In many situations, again, if the officer can thoroughly articulate why he engaged in the level of force and the level of violence against a non-compliant person, oftentimes they will be exonerated. They will be given a pass. It is important that not only black men, but black men in sketchy, shady, and I put that in quotations, neighborhoods where officers are patrolling, where they are on high alert all the time, particularly being patrolled by officers who don't live in that community, officers who live in a neighboring state or several counties away, who have no connection to that community. They will often over-police that community, and they will engage in tactics that oftentimes police officers in non-sketchy and non-urban and non-black communities, they will not invoke those techniques and tactics. So it's important, if you're in a rough neighborhood, a high crime neighborhood, if you are a black individual, if you are a black male, it is important that you do not engage in certain types of behavior to simply just escalate and justify an officer engaging in police brutality. Now, when I say justify, it's not justifiable. But the way, right now we're in a pre-police reform era. Right now, the way the policies and the procedures and the protections that officers have, it does allow them to draw their weapons in unnecessary situations. It does allow them to throw you to the ground. It does allow them to even kneel on you, press you, and to in certain jurisdictions, to choke you for a certain period of time, if depending on the level of non-compliance, to tase you. All of these things need to be taken into consideration. If you want to avoid police brutality, know the area that you're being pulled over in and know how the police looks at you and values you. Oftentimes, when I'm being pulled over and I have a full suit on, nothing happens to me. But I know if I have a certain outfit on and I have a car full of other black guys and we just look like we're up to no good, we're going to be treated differently. Whether an officer will engage in police brutality often depends on the level of compliance we display. So a lot of people will say, well, it's up to the person who's being pulled over. It's up to the person who's coming into contact with the officer. That's not how it should be in totality. There should be a set standard of how and when and what level of aggression or physical violence that the officer is going to use. And a lot of it's discretionary, and it differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, from neighborhood to neighborhood, and from sex, gender, and from race. So right now, police brutality often is at the discretion of the officer, and whether it will be deemed a legitimate warranted tactic used by the officer, or whether it will be determined that it was police brutality, is determined by the department heads at the law enforcement agency and the prosecutor. And right now, the way things are set up, for the most part, they're viewed highly against the person who comes in contact with the officer. And we all know, and we've all seen, that if it's engaging with a black person, the level of force and the level of police brutality that was executed against Eric Garner was absolutely unjustifiable, and it was horrible, but it was legal, and it was allowed. The guy is selling loose cigarettes. That's over-policing him. Give him a citation and keep it walking. He doesn't have to be put under arrest. He doesn't have to be yelled at and detained and then put in a chokehold and then thrown to the ground and then just held down after he's begging for his life, and they felt the need to continue to hold him down. There were several officers there. They could have gotten up and surrounded him, and even if they kept their guns drawn on him or tasers drawn on him, and he could have breathed and he could be alive now. But the way the department procedures dictates, and the way the state's attorney for Staten Island viewed it, like, we're not prosecuting them. It was justifiable. One of the worst cases of police brutality is Tamar Rice, little baby boy. If the police could have just arrived at the park, the facts said that this individual, the person who called the police on Tamar Rice, said it may be a toy gun. The officers could have arrived, and instead of jumping into gear with their guns and engaging in police violence and police brutality and police murder, maybe if they would have parked their car a certain distance away from Tamar Rice, positioned their car where they could take cover, and give him instructions over their loudspeakers. Young man, drop the gun. I'm sure Tamar Rice, who wasn't a thug, who was just a fun-loving little boy who had a toy gun, who had a toy in his hand, would be alive today. But no questions, no asking. You pull up on a scene, you see a young child, you see an adult, you see anybody with a weapon, you just start shooting, and then you ask questions later. That is the ultimate form of, and a sick form of, police brutality, police violence, and just murder that can be justified and that can be allowed and can receive the blessings of the authority. This is where we need police reform, so that police brutality can be deleted and can be disallowed in many situations where it currently is allowed. Another follow-up question was, how can police brutality be proven? It can be proven by witnesses coming forward and testifying. It can be proven by the victim's medical records. It can be proven by photographs. It can be proven by videotapes. We've all seen how the racist, disgusting police officers in Minneapolis wrote up a very, very convincing and typical police report after George Floyd died. And it indicated that a medical incident took place while he was in police custody and he died. Luckily, a 17-year-old child videotaped the entire action and she videotaped a lynching that took place in front of cameras. That was the best evidence, and that evidence and that videotape led to his conviction. You can't, there is one source of evidence to prove that police brutality took place that's even better. I know it's hard to believe, but even better than a videotape is other officers who are on the scene, who watch officers break the law and unnecessarily assault and engage in violence against the citizens for no reason, simply because they're having a bad day or because they are in fact racist and they don't believe that the subject who they're putting in custody, that their lives matter. A noble officer coming forward and giving their version of what took place. That is probably one of the most powerful forms of evidence in terms of proving whether or not the officer or officers engaged in police brutality. So that is my definition of police brutality, and that is one of the few ways you can prove police brutality. I hope this helps, and I hope this clarifies things, but ultimately it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, and it's going to come down to the level of resisting that the subject puts up and the level of compliance. You put those together up against the amount of aggression and violence that the officer is engaging in, and then you can determine whether there is police brutality or not. All right, thank you for your time, and be safe. If you ever want any more detailed information, you can always go to my website, defendmeincourt.com, and you can submit your questions through our website, or you can just hit me up on Facebook. All right, thank you. Bye.